as well. I mean, I went to public schools. My mom was a public school teacher. I taught in public schools. My wife taught in public schools. And so I hate when people say, Jeremy, you're so against public schooling. Actually, no, I don't mind the concept of the government paying for education. I'm not against that at all, right? I'm against anything that excludes, the most important questions, and parading around as education.
Very special guest today on the podcast. Jeremy Tate is here, and he talks about classical education and the renaissance that's happening right now in the education space in the United States. He walks us through a little bit of a history of how we got here and what needs to change and how that's going to change. But he runs Classical Learning Test, CLT, that does assessments around classical education. So let's jump right into the interview with Jeremy.
Well, today we have Jeremy Tate on the podcast, who primarily, he's a father of 6, so that qualifies him to be on the Two Cent Dad podcast, but he's also co-founder and president of the Classical Learning Test, who is slowly, reforming the education system in the U.S., or opening people's eyes, I'd like to say, Jeremy. So I'm excited to have you on to talk about this kind of renaissance or movement that's going on in the education system.
Hey, Mike, thrilled to
today.
be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah. So we have a lot to cover. I know you also host an Anchored podcast, and you do a lot around classical education. And I want to cover a lot. So I'm a little bit excited. So I want to hear a little bit about your story, because you actually are quite far from where you started. Coming out of college as a teacher in the New York City school system, and now you're kind of a leading voice in, I think, shining a light on how far our education system, or how much it's changed in the last 50 plus years, like in that, since the Department of Education came about and everything. And that's something that's super fascinating to me that I think a lot of people maybe aren't clued into. So I'd like to hear, maybe you could start there, your story coming out of college and kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, Mike, really thrilled to be here. My mom was a teacher growing up, French and Spanish teacher. I actually refused to learn the language just because I was a kind of a punk middle school kid. But, going into my senior year in high school, I had a conversion to Christianity and just started reading books. Somebody gave me a copy of Mere Christianity. And so in college, I was a bit of a hermit, made up for a bunch of lost time, and decided I actually wanted to become a pastor. Started off at Westminster Theological Seminary. And at the same time, then I started teaching in New York City. This would have been 2004, 2007, and over the period of about 6 years, I was finishing seminary, and I was teaching at the same time. And I was really shocked at seeing the disconnect between the way, like, every other generation had understood education, like the basic purpose of what we're doing. Like, they understood it completely differently than what we were trying to do in 2022. And at every school I was at, whether it was inner city New York, teaching in Brooklyn, or Old Mill High School, or Broadneck High School, I mean, that's a range from like, a very intense urban setting to really a super affluent suburban setting. I saw kind of a spiritual wasteland. The most fundamental needs of these students for purpose, for meaning, for truth, is just completely neglected. In some ways, it was just kind of like massive spiritual neglect on kind of a wide scale, right? And so, yeah, one of the things I noticed, when I was there, and especially leaving the public school arena after just kind of having enough of it, was the way that big companies like the College Board, ACT, play a huge role in education. But that may be getting a bit ahead of the story.
No, I think that is, because I think, I've read some of the stuff that you put out about that time period, and you said you kind of talk about all of the rampant breakdown of the family and how that carried into education. And I think people can see that, but I think what maybe isn't as apparent on the surface is some of the other things that were at play to kind of get us to the point that we're at. And to me, I think that's super interesting, especially as we're in a period right now where higher education is kind of in a weird spot where it's, I don't know, maybe plateauing or where, the value is maybe coming down while the costs are going up in certain areas, certain colleges, certain universities. And So it seems like we're on this like cusp of disruption. So you kind of naturally have to ask yourself, well, how do we get here? And that's what I'm kind of.
Oh yeah, I think we're in the midst of it,
So
of a massive disruption. I mean, I think finally about 10 years ago, people started questioning, what is the value of a 4-year college degree? What does it even mean? What does it convey? What does it signify? I think COVID forced a lot of parents to kind of go back and start asking questions about first principles, like what are we even doing in education? What's the point? And what's interesting to me, Mike, is that education didn't change very much for a really, really long time, right? I mean, you can go back to, reading the Republic. You can read Augustine's Confessions. Basically, what we would call classical education was really in place from in the ancient world through the early centuries of the church, really through the beginning of the 20th century, right? What was a good education? And a good education was rooted in philosophy, in classical languages, studying logic and grammar and rhetoric, right? Everything that was kind of the meat and potatoes of a really good education has been stripped away. I think so much so that even America's founding generation, I don't think that they would recognize it as education when we say, oh yeah, we don't do any languages, classical languages anymore. We don't do any philosophy. We don't do morality or religion. We don't do ethics. All of the things that were central are now gone, and it's actually really vague what we're trying to do. Develop skills. Well, what kind of skills? It's all very, very unclear. I think the other thing that was happening generation after generation is that education was this beautiful passing down. I had this image in my head I'd love to share with you, but I was at a bar mitzvah. One of the few bar mitzvahs I've ever been to. This is probably 8 or 10 years ago as I'm kind of sorting through all of this. And there was this really beautiful picture. It was one of my daughter's friends who was a very tiny little girl. And her parents physically passed down to her this massive Torah. And it was beautiful because, she's holding it and you can hardly see the little girl behind the massive Torah. But it was a physical, literal passing down of this beautiful spiritual and intellectual inheritance. That's fundamentally what education was. This is how Chesterton described it, right? That education is the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to the next. And I have found that in mainstream education, that has been almost completely lost. And I think that's what we're hoping to raise awareness of with CLT. And I think throughout the classical renewal movement that now is really, really starting to pick up traction.
Yeah, so the passing down, I mean, to me that conjures up images of like homeschooling or like a community, a more like family unit, a larger extended family, that sort of thing, where you're around even like your grandparents, that sort of thing, where it's a collective kind of passing down. Like, how does that relate to, maybe our current educational model? Like when did that kind of pop up? Because I think for some people they realize, okay, this doesn't seem right, but is this the way it's always been? Because that's just the near past has been kind of you go to school for a certain number of hours a day. You kind of do the school thing. I'm talking like K through 12, kind of period, right? But that's relatively recent. That's one thing you talk about, right? And you say the model has changed. You just said that the founding fathers wouldn't even call what we're doing.
Yeah, it wouldn't be recognizable for sure. Mike, one book I would love to recommend for your audience. It's coming out in June, and I got an early copy, and I'm about finished reading the early edition here. But it's called Battle for the American Mind, and so kind of a play, of course, with Alan Bloom's 1986, The Closing of the American Mind. But again, the title is The Battle for the American Mind. It's Pete Hegseth and David Goodwin. David is kind of a lay historian of the history of education in America. And absolutely, I mean, what you really have is embracing aspects of the Industrial Revolution, applying those to education, and at a time when everything connected to progressivism seemed to be working, right? The advances that were being made in agriculture and in medicine. And so that there was a distinct philosophy of education with this movement as well that was really connected to kind of a utilitarian outlook, right? That there's no purpose in learning Latin if you're not going to use it, right? Education, instead of it being this thing that shaped you, the main idea was that you should be able to go use it to do these certain things that you want to do. And so we kind of gave up on this endeavor of human formation, which really can never be mass produced, right? And so when we went to the compulsory education model, beginning really right after the Civil War in Massachusetts, and then really by all 50 states by the 1920s had compulsory education laws, you can't have a classical human forming compulsory education system. And so this utilitarian way of doing it was a way of kind of mass producing it and introducing really a factory model into education.
Yeah, and so you have you get to that factory model, and then a couple generations in after the 20s and the 50s is like it becomes just kind of the standard,
Yeah.
right? That's what you do. And I mean, what I heard you say and what I would agree with is like with the pandemic and all that, people kind of like eyes opening and questioning the current system and saying, okay, what are we doing here, and what's happening, or maybe embracing it too, because homeschooling is kind of on the rise, or maybe they're looking at, hey, we want to get them into a different school or different model or something, right? Is that kind of what happened? You had this kind of I hate to say eyes open, but it just forced you to say, what, is this just childcare that they're learning
I mean,
facts,
and the takeover
what?
was so complete, that you go back to before the Civil War, and we're talking about very small one-room schoolhouses, a lot of homeschooling, to within a few generations, it just becomes so normal that nobody remembers it being any other way, right? And it's this way, I think really it peaks in probably the 1960s or early 70s, when there are very few exceptions. The Catholic schools, start a massive decline in the 1960s. And really nobody is questioning it. In 1973, there's about 13,000 homeschoolers nationwide, right? That number now is over 5 million. And so it's really all been within the last generation that people have really started to question, what is this thing that we've bought into? Where did it arise from? And is it really passing down what I care most about for my children? Clearly, Mike, at your house, you've got 5 kiddos. You've made a decision to opt out and to homeschool, which I love to hear. And I think we're going to see continued exponential growth for some time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, like you kind of the opting out, but the opting, I think it's almost like you're opting into taking responsibility for your children's education. Because one thing that we always talk about with parents is like, well, people might say, well, you're anti-public school. Well, it's not really that. It's that I don't really think that's a working model, but it can maybe work, in certain locales or even a private school. But ultimately, philosophically, we believe we are the primary responsibility for educating and passing down to our children. And that can happen through the tools that we use, or as you define homeschool or whatever, can be a variety. And it can vary based on the child, like based on their learning style or what, how they're adapting to things. And I think that's a key distinction, because it's kind of like, what are you for as opposed to what are you against? Like that's a conversation that comes up.
I really love that you say that. And I've heard that as well. I mean, I went to public schools. My mom was a public school teacher. I taught in public schools. My wife taught in public schools. And so I hate when people say, Jeremy, you're so against public schooling. Actually, no, I don't mind the concept of the government paying for education. I'm not against that at all, right? I'm against anything that excludes, the most important questions, and parading around as education, right? Because I think it has this placebo effect on young people. I remember, I love to tell this story, but I came into teaching through the world of kind of youth ministry. I was a convert through something called Young Life. And so during an advisory class, when I was teaching at Broad Neck High School, there were some students that were, just kind of overheard them talking about how much they hate school and they don't want to go to college. And so I just kind of jumped into the conversation, and I was saying, well, think about the amazing questions that we get to think about. Why are we here? Why do we exist? What is human happiness? What is freedom? What's the point of life? And they were like, we don't talk about any of that stuff ever, And so there's this hugely missed opportunity when this hunger that young people have is at its peak. We fail to meet them there.
Yeah. Yeah, I strongly believe that. I mean, that's one thing. So my wife was the oldest of 8, and they all homeschooled, and so I feel like her perspective was stronger around homeschool and the power of it. I was for a shorter time, and I was the youngest, so I had a different experience. But the biggest aha has been you are just feeding fuel to a fire that already exists. You're not really trying to start the fire with kids and their curiosity and their learning. And I think one very strong opinion I have is that I feel like an institutionalized schooling system can really just beats the love of learning out of children. That is I think a huge evil, because it turns them off to it for the rest of their life. Then they're just like, just relay the facts. What facts do I have to use, to get, and not every case, not every public school, not every teacher. I'm not saying that, but I think the system itself is conducive to that. And I think that's extremely sad. It's like you have these kids that could be great kids, or they have these gifts or these learning styles that could do so much, but it's just been beat out of them. When you had a fire that you just needed to kind of kindle, it's like a fire. It's got to be gentle with it. When it's a little flame, you don't want to throw a big log on it, right? You can put a little bit of lint on there, get it going. It's like, and that's what it's about.
Yeah, I love that. That's very well said.
So Jeremy, you said not a lot of people realized the path that things were going from, say, just after the Civil War up to like the 70s. You mentioned the Catholic schools. Like, tell me a little bit about that process. Is it completely driven by, these big companies that were saying, hey, we have to have an industrialized model because we got to have, a workforce? That's something that's often heard. Or was it that just you had so much money that from the government that was coming in that they were funding the system? Or, what were some of the key drivers that kind of got us to where we're at? Because how do we avoid those in the future? Like, if we're thinking towards the future to say, how do we not end up in this mess, or how do we fix some of the
It's
things?
a great question. I mean, how did we go from, where all education was basically classical education to now it's this kind of strange thing that maybe 5 or 10% of households are engaged with either through homeschooling or through brick and mortar schools? I think there was, again, kind of a number of hacks along the way. It couldn't have happened quickly, right? Because the change has been so dramatic that it only could have happened over a long period of time. I think people would have been very alarmed to introduce what is now the mainstream experience from what the kind of formation that they were getting. And so, I think over a period of time, you have clear moments. A big moment, of course, is something like Sputnik in the 1950s, where, you have an aha. This is kind of a final blow to a focus on the humanities and classical literature and these things. It's the obsession. And I know, Mike, you're an engineer, so we could have all kinds of great conversations about this. But my own thought is actually, what is more terrifying than an engineer or a coding wizard or scientific technical knowledge completely divorced from ethical formation is terrifying. I can't imagine what is more terrifying. But that's where we start.
That's like Terminator movies, right? I think that's what conjures up,
absolutely,
right?
absolutely. I mean, there's tremendous moral responsibility to have the kind of power that technology has given us, and yet we've removed kids completely from even thinking about the ethical consequences of what they can do with technology. So I think you do have moments like that, like in the 50s, where we took a clear jump nationally, even further away from what education always had been.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is you have this, even in the last like 20, 30 years, you have this like this emphasis on like the social sciences too, and like the liberal arts kind of education, almost like softening on some of the STEM stuff. So this is my observation. Maybe this is incorrect, but you kind of have these opposing views of like, oh, you can get a degree in like communication, and you don't really, from a local college, and you don't really study anything of value. And then people on the STEM side would be like, no, you got to learn like hard sciences, and you got to get a degree in something that's worth, like nursing or engineering or something, which is good. I think there's, because you have a path to a career, from a purely financial standpoint, but they seem to both be missing the mark if they're only striving at that.
It does make sense, but I think even what you call the liberal arts, right, or the understanding of the humanities, I mean, I am convinced that at 80-90% of colleges that call themselves liberal arts, if you walked onto campus and asked 5 professors, they couldn't possibly tell you what the seven liberal arts were as traditionally defined. The general conception even of,
Mm.
mainstream America of a liberal arts college is literally that it conveys some kind of like political leftist connotation, right? This idea of education is fundamentally what is Frederick Douglass's definition of education? It's that education is emancipation, right? That it's this transition from darkness into light. That it's freedom from being enslaved to your own impulses and desires. That vision of education, I think, is what is still missing, even if there is I think David Coleman, he's the CEO of the College Board, an interesting character. Here's a guy who's a Rhodes Scholar, PhD in philosophy from Oxford, and so if anybody you would think would want to move the giant ship of the College Board, and I think it's been at best kind of soulless version of the liberal arts, because at the end of the day, there's still no moral framework that it's connected to, and so it still pushes relativism and I think skepticism towards everything, and this new god of the only actual truth can come from science.
Yeah, which is conducive to the model of the industrialized system, right? I mean, that's it. If that's big picture, what's happening of like a replacement of an absolute truth with just science is the absolute truth, then by all means you'd want to just churn out as many people that just have the scientific facts, right? Like,
yeah. Oh, I think it is.
Is that
I think
right
it
or
is
no?
for sure. I mean that is one. This is a formative question. Like, where do we look for answers to questions about ultimate purpose and meaning, right? And historically, science never attempted to give us questions about meaning at all. That wasn't the purpose of science, right? And so we've had this conflation of philosophy with science, where kids look to it now as a source for meaning and ultimate truth, and that's never been the purpose of science.
So where do you think this is leading? So you obviously started down the CLT, classical learning test path, because you were doing ACT prep,
Yeah.
as to put food on the table, and then you saw, oh, there's got to be this assessment for classical education. You kind of, that's my interpretation of that. But now, where is this kind of going? It seems to me like it's kind of diverging, and there's people that are staying in the current system. There's people that are kind of opting out or
Yeah.
opting into. And you mentioned one time, which relatively down the road from us, is Hillsdale, which is like the only college that has like not accepted like federal funding. Their like enrollment and numbers are up. Like everything is up, and then like everything else on the most
Yeah.
colleges are down. And I know people have gone to Hillsdale. I've always been really impressed. Everyone spoke really highly of it. And so I'm just kind of curious, where does this kind of lead? Where does it go over the next like decade?
Yeah, I appreciate that,
two?
and Mike, love to kind of give a bit of a context with the idea behind CLT. And so, essentially 2013, 2014, I transitioned out of the public school system into a great Catholic school, Mount DeSales Academy in Catonsville, Maryland, which is where my daughter goes now. It's run by these really lovely Dominican sisters there. And I was also running their SAT, ACT prep company. And so I kind of got myself really immersed into the actual content that was on an SAT or ACT. And I think at best it's just really boring, right? And one of the reasons it's boring is because they have what they call a sensitivity committee. And, if any passage could offend a kid for any reason, it's going to be distracting to them in the test taking process. And so I get how this developed. It makes sense. That's probably well intended for the student, but it's gotten really crazy. And so even something like a reference to married parents, right? Well, that would be offensive to kids who have divorced parents. That could trigger them. So we can't have that. Oh, and we can't have a reference to gender because the kid's non-binary. That would be really offensive to them. And so we're left with, literally, this is how you get passages just about, the history of mustard seed, which is kind of interesting, whatever, or penguins in Antarctica, and this is their habitat. But you have no meaningful, timeless text. And so the thought with CLT was, what?
Yeah.
These tests end up driving curriculum, right? If teachers and schools knew, okay, on the SAT, my students are going to have to read Thomas Aquinas. They're going to have to be able to read C.S. Lewis and Flannery O'Connor and Jane Austen and Du Bois and Frederick Douglass. If they knew that was the kind of text that their students were going to have to read on the test that mattered most, And think about what that would do to mainstream education, you know? So the CLT idea in some ways was very simple. It was like, okay, what if you took the most important test and you required students to be able to read the best of what has been thought and said, right? The kind of education that I think all of America's founders had, a classical education. And, you know, historically in the CLT 7-year journey, people push back because that doesn't sound very global. It sounds like we're just making a case for the Western canon. And granted, the CLT does lean heavily into the Western canon. We do have others on there like Averroes and Avicenna and Confucius, and there are some Eastern greats on there as well. But you know, in other parts of the world right now, in India, CLT's most second popular country is India right now, because this
Wow.
kind of education is valued around the world way more than the kind of secular progressive education that is now mainstream. You know, and you know, one of my friends who you may have noticed on Twitter, his name is Sachin. He's kind of a Catholic social media influencer. You know, we've chatted before where he'll say, you know, this education is being kind of shamed in America, where it's being discovered in other parts of the world as this great treasure. You know, um,
Yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed that in India, especially India. You know, is so they're so like rote with a lot of their education and very. I wouldn't have. I would just wouldn't have thought that. So that's really, but it's really encouraging
yeah, I
and
think
neat to
that the
see.
movement really is happening, you know, worldwide as well. Though I mean, we've just been so quickly catapulted into the modern world, and we've been so radically cut off from history. And you know, recovering your history and your story is this fundamental component of understanding your own identity. And I think we're just going to continue to see more of this in the years to come.
So where so basically what you just said is we have it's growing internationally probably faster and at a quicker rate, you know, than domestically. So does that drive? Do you think where do you think the policy is going to go in the U.S. You know, with there's got to be a message that's being sent to central, you know, education about these massive homeschooling numbers that you mentioned earlier. You know, up to multi millions now from just a couple decades ago. It was in the
Yeah.
thousands, right? And so that has to be doing. It's gonna have that's sending a powerful message, right? That's a vote. Even if they're not that they're voting with their decision,
Hmm.
and so it seems like
Yeah.
that's gonna be
You know,
gonna do
one of my
something.
good friends, Lexi Hudson. Lexi is over at Civic Renaissance now. She started Civic Renaissance, but she's written for all the big publications. But she worked for about 2 years at the Department of Education. And Lexi said there was no awareness or even understanding of the recovery efforts to recover traditional classical education. And in some ways, you think about this, Mike, this may be unprecedented, I wonder, in the history, at least of America, where you have kind of an intellectual revival happening almost entirely outside of universities. And in some ways, universities seem to have no
Mm.
idea, you know, that it's going on. You have these classical education groups, the Society for Classical Learning, the Association of Classical Christian Schools, the CRC Institute, CLT. You've got a rapidly growing movement that, for the most part, I mean, yes, you have great colleges. Hillsdale, Grove City, Benedictine, Thomas Aquinas College, St. John's here in Annapolis, that are absolutely on board and working to champion this kind of education as well. But it is to me very interesting historically that you have an effort to recover a kind of education that was almost lost, and that recovery effort is happening in homes, in local communities, really outside of mainstream education, outside of the Department of Ed, outside of most universities.
What else do you see? Are you kind of plugged in with the I would say alternative or co-op type homeschool programs? There's some programs that are even just small little homeschool pods maybe
Mm.
that are started up with where they hire even like a teacher or something, right? Like there's all these hybrids, if you will, that are popping up. Can you speak to that a little bit of what you're seeing there? Because some people are maybe not they're like, oh, I'm not going to be the full homeschool, in the home the whole time type model. But then they're like, well, I don't know about a private school, or they're
Yeah.
doing something in between. And where's classical
That's a great
education in
question. I
that?
mean, it's kind of the Wild West right now. I mean, you've got these
Yeah.
a few huge groups. I mean, classical conversations, obviously way bigger than any other, with 150,000 students worldwide. A lot of their growth has been in Russia and in South America over the past couple of years as well. But it's been interesting. CLT works with a ton of university model schools and independent homeschoolers and groups like Seton and Mother Divine Grace and Colby. But we also have noticed that a lot of our really high performing students are what we call independents. And they're not connected to any umbrella group at all. And it's been interesting to me because I'll typically call, I've kind of gotten out of the habit actually, but I would typically call for years the top score recipient, their family, and to say, hey, great job on the last test. Your son or daughter, got one of the highest scores. And more often than not, they're independent homeschoolers. And it's really blown my mind. I mean, we've never done this. We homeschooled for 3 years. We put them back in brick and mortar 2 years ago. So we had 2 babies in about 19 months. We'll have at least one of them back homeschooling next year. We're kind of doing it all. But it's interesting to me, as I've talked to some of these families. In fact, this young man, Matthew Tolbert, he was the first to ever get a perfect 120 on the CLT. First to ever do this. And he was on our podcast on Anchor, which you mentioned early on. And he was saying, growing up, there was no difference between life and education. All of education was all of life, and all of life was education. And you weren't ever reading to get something done. You were reading because the world's fascinating and amazing. And somehow they had cultivated that in their son in just such a beautiful and powerful way. And so, but that model, that kind of independent model is actually terrifying for a lot of people. It's kind of terrifying for my wife. She's like, no, I want structure and accountability, not doing this kind of do your own thing, this unschooling model. So, I think it would be dangerous to think that there are, that any one of these methods is maybe better than any others. I think so many factors, the student, the particular child is hugely important. The local community, the parental support, the grandparent support, what's financially feasible. I think all of these are big factors that are in play. And then also, what are the viable brick and mortar options nearby? Our chief assessment officer here at CLT, Tracy Gardner, she sends her kids to Great Hearts because look, they've got a free, great classical publicly funded option, just a mile from their house, whereas that's not the option for most families.
Yeah. And it seems like that there's almost like the temptation to then bring it to the lowest common denominator in that too. Well, people don't have this, don't have this, don't have this. And so you kind of got to get the bar set super low as opposed to, okay, let's look at what situations people are in and how you can meet them where they're at to some degree with curriculums and that sort of thing. When you say it's the Wild West, I think that's what's interesting is you have on one end of the spectrum, you have in-home homeschoolers, or maybe you could say one's far extreme of this spectrum is like no structure, kind of these unschooling. And then over here you have like a classic public, education, and people are just trying to figure it out, and they're trying to figure it out based on what needs they have, and then what resources they have at home too to leverage. And I think that's a fascinating. It's gonna be a fascinating development.
Now, Mike, are you doing an umbrella group? Or are you doing an independent model? Are you connected to an association?
We kind of, we're not really. We're my wife's philosophy is like we'll take it 1 year at a time, and if we want to put a kid in school too, like that's fine. We're just taking it 1 year at a time, which I think is a good outlook, And I'll confess, my wife does like 95% of the schooling, so plus, and but we do just a mix of different curriculum, and then we just do a 1 day a week co-op at like there's a local homeschooling group that meets at a local church. But we've looked at like classical conversations, some other things like that, and we just haven't pulled the trigger on those. But we're just kind of taking it a year at a time.
Love that.
So yeah, and partly it's the we're kind of, I would say we're more like anti of like very rigorous, if we get too much in a rigorous system, you're kind of like, well, why are we doing this in the first place? The whole first place is we don't want to it become too much of a burden, and we want to be able to speak into it. We want to have time to explore things and explore curiosities that they have, and all of that. Like, that's the advantages of homeschool in our
That's
opinion.
beautiful.
So,
I love that.
yeah. So, yeah. Well, thank you, Jeremy, so much for sharing your story and kind of what you guys are doing. I think it is in the season of disruption for education. It's a little crazy, but exciting to see where it's going.
And Mike, thanks for the work that you're doing. You know, I'm convinced that, you know, the future of America very much, I think, is connected to the recovery effort, the work that's going on in homeschools. And you spoke earlier just about that decision to take responsibility. And at the end of the day, I think that's the most fundamental shift that parents across the country, you know, education is formation, it is human formation, and therefore at the end of the day, it never can be outsourced to somebody else to do that hard work. So it's always a delight to connect with homeschool families. Love what you're doing with the 2 Cent Dad podcast for sure, and we'll certainly push it out on our end here at CLT when it releases.
All right. Well, thanks, Jeremy.
Awesome.